Hello, and welcome on this, of course, 4th of July, or the 4th of July weekend. We have the readings today from Ezekiel, the prophet, chapter 2, verses 2 through 5. We continue to get a section of St. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, this time chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. And the Gospel according to Mark begins with chapter 6, with verses 1 through 6a. So here again, remember, we're going to just take a half of the 6th verse, which we will pick up next time to continue onward. As you remember, in the Gospel of Mark, we considered the 5th chapter, in which 3 healings had taken place: the healing of the Gerasene man, the healing of Jairus' daughter, and the healing of the woman who had been suffering from hemorrhaging. And one remembers that each of them had a certain faith, or left with a certain faith in Jesus' power to be a healer, that the power of God in some wonderful way was at work through him. So I've also mentioned, it seems to be very difficult for the 12 to truly appreciate Jesus as the Messiah. And that problem, we will see, is exasperated in the section of the gospel that we're going to hear this time. For having really created a certain reputation for himself, certainly as a healer, we're not exactly sure where in Galilee some of these things had taken place, but probably close to the city of Capernaum, which you remember we've in other occasions mentioned was sort of the centering place for Jesus, his operating headquarters, if you want. It had been a major fishing place, town, port, and it was there that the first disciples, Peter and Andrew, James and John, also fishermen, had come from. In today's gospel, Jesus now returns to his hometown, the hometown of which we know to be Nazareth. Basically, we would probably call it an agricultural place. It's the inner part of the Galilee. The Galilee, too, I've mentioned before, is known as what is called Upper Galilee and Lower Galilee. Nazareth would have been in the lower section. Nazareth, we're not quite sure how large it was. Estimates range anywhere from 800 to 1,000 people, thus still making it a village and not significantly large, although for its time perhaps important. But if you take 1,000 people or even 800 people, see that many of them are what we would call clans, that is family units, there probably were not a lot of differential relationships going on in a village like Nazareth. So Jesus now returns to Nazareth, and he goes on the Sabbath to teach in the synagogue. Now, I've mentioned before, Jesus is not a priest, and teachers in the synagogue could be any lay person. It doesn't necessarily mean you had to be kind of specifically chosen, ordained, as it were, to be a teacher, although certainly certain persons had the qualities to be good teachers and probably more regularly led the community on the Sabbath gatherings. Anyway, Jesus now teaches. As always in Mark's gospel, we're never quite sure what it is that Jesus is teaching, because Mark is not particularly noted for giving a lot of teachings of Jesus. But the audience that is gathered there are kind of amazed at Jesus' teaching, but now begins something that we perhaps did not expect. Having been admired at first a series of questions arise by those who are gathered there, Nazarenes. Where did Jesus get all this teaching? Where comes his wisdom? What about his mighty works? How does he do that? Why is he not fulfilling the identity that he had when he was with us? And we find even his household now raising questions like this. So, what we do know, and this would be a problem here, is that the Nazarenes had their own fixed ideas as to when, where, and how the Messiah should appear. And thus it seems that Jesus does not fit the bill for any of those questions. In fact, as we hear, and it's how you read this, now I suppose because people hear this in church and we read it on Sunday, we read it with a certain respect. Isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary? But what if we read it in a way that is critical, in a way that there is, wait a minute, who does he think he is? We know who he is. He's the carpenter. He's the son of Mary. We know his sisters and brothers who live here with us. Whence comes this prophet, this wisdom teacher? In effect, notice if you put the voice to it, who does he think he is? We know who he is. Who does he think he is? So that's what Jesus now meets in Nazareth, and this is quite surprising, because one would think as Jesus had been going along and working wonderful signs and healings, that word had kind of drifted back to Nazareth, that they would be greeting him as a beloved son, as someone who has brought reputation for goodness to Nazareth. Instead, they now raise these rather challenging questions. What are these questions that are raised by the community? Well, they say, isn't this the carpenter? Now, it's only in Mark's gospel that Jesus is known as a carpenter. Matthew later on will call him a carpenter's son, which doesn't mean that he wouldn't be a carpenter, but that, and we pointed this out before, that the different synoptic writers take the information of Mark and give it little different turns and twists according to how it fits their plan. Anyway, a carpenter, and we pointed this out before, that a carpenter probably would have better described in some of the translations to give this as a craftsman, someone who knew how to take care of the things that a village might have expectations for. We've mentioned it before when we were speaking once about Joseph, that it doesn't necessarily mean he worked with wood, but he could, kind of fixing cartwheels and things like that would have been with wood, but also a man who could take care of other issues that villagers maybe didn't have the skill or the time to repair or to fix. So in a way, a craftsman could be someone who was original in the works that they made, or could be more in the role of maintenance, keeping things running smoothly for those who lived in the village. And so Jesus is here identified as a workman, an ordinary guy, as far as the villagers can see, who kind of had this particular craft. And then they say, isn't this Mary's son? Now this has gotten some new ink review in recent times. I don't mean to be hurt anyone's feelings here. Of course, when we read it, as we do now, Mary's son, what a wonderful title and what a wonderful privilege given to Mary, to his mother. But if you think about it, in the first century world, men were generally kind of given a sense of identity, not because of their mother, but because of their father. And so most appropriately, according to the times, it might have been said, isn't this Jesus, the son of Joseph? But to say Mary's son, well, what does that mean? What could that mean? Now, most interpreters, and that's, as I mentioned, because of the devotion that we have for Our Lady that has moved on through the centuries, see this as simply, well, maybe indicating that at this point Mary was a widow, that Joseph, who disappears from the scene there, that might well explain why he wasn't there, because he had died. But still, even though the man had been deceased, didn't mean that he wouldn't be known by his father's name. So that doesn't exactly answer the question. Some, and there's a few interpreters, now keep in mind, what we're looking at is what we can best understand about the whole background of this first gospel, could be an indication that the villagers did not really know the origin of Jesus in terms of parenthood. Now, later on, Matthew and Luke will include what we call, we've looked at these earlier in the year, infancy narratives, in which they do explain how Jesus was conceived. But what if you didn't have that background? What if you didn't know those stories? What if, therefore, you found a village maiden pregnant? Well, wouldn't the natural question be about, well, I say natural, but wouldn't most of you say, I wonder who the father is? And if there is a Joseph there, well, then that would explain it. But if it were, and of course this is very important because our tradition has developed an understanding of the virginity of Mary, that therefore the conception of Jesus was in a unique way. That makes Mary, Jesus therefore as the son of Mary, makes sense. If, however, it were kind of insulting that somehow they didn't know who the father was, there wasn't a Joseph in the town of Nazareth, and a village of Nazareth, and the parenthood of the child was unknown, one or two interpreters see this as a slur, that they're really kind of saying this woman, Mary, didn't really own up to the values of the village. Again, that's a possible interpretation, not widely supported, by the way. So I'd be very careful here just to kind of mention this as we're looking at this delicate question. And then there is some evidence in the first century world of other men who were also identified by their mother. So this was not unique to Mark's tradition. There was a John who was called the son of Dorcas, that's a lady's name, and a Joseph who is known as the son of Itrina. And so that might be that Mark was aware of that. And others would point out that at the foot of the cross, as Jesus was dying, there is mention there of Mary, the mother of James and Joses. So perhaps that use of that phrase is something which is typically Markan. But I mention all of that because some discussion has certainly developed around that particular insight that he is the son of Mary. This is followed by the fact that they also say, see, we know the carpenter, we know his mother, we know also his brothers and sisters. Now, 4 names are mentioned as brothers: James, Joses, Jude, and Simon, and unnamed sisters. Interesting, and this, of course, would probably be part of the first century patriarchal language. Do not name who the sisters are here. So we don't know whether it's 2 sisters, 3 sisters, or how big the family is. Well, now this raises some issues. And there are 3 possible solutions which are offered. What's the issue? Who are these brothers and sisters? What does it mean? Did he have brothers and sisters? Well, one argument is, so I said there are 3. The first is that they are natural children of Joseph and Mary. Some of the great thinkers in the early church For example, one of the most important writers, Tertullian, argued that this was the case. And many of our non-Catholic scholars also believe that these were natural children of Mary and Joseph. Now, why would this make sense? Because, and remember that Luke is very careful when he, in his account of the birth of Jesus, says that she gave birth to her firstborn son. Now, one could say firstborn son, that she had no children prior to that, but doesn't exclude the fact that there could have been children afterwards. So the argument that these were natural brothers and sisters of Jesus is a position held by many, even some Catholic scholars today, do believe that this was a natural family from which Jesus came. A second position is known as the Epionian solution, which simply says that this was a second marriage on the part of Joseph, that he had been a widow, that he had married Mary, and therefore he had children by his former marriage, and that therefore they were, well, I suppose we would say stepbrothers and sisters today in our language, but that would explain why they were mentioned as part of Jesus' family. Well, that's one viewpoint. The viewpoint there is it makes Joseph always appear older. We've looked at that before. And that's one of the ways in which, because there would be a concern developing quite early in the 2nd and 3rd century for the case of the virginity of Mary. And therefore, obviously, it takes on a very physical sense of virgin. Although, as I think I've mentioned before, the idea of virgin in the scriptural tradition does not automatically mean non-sexual contact. It means that a virgin is one who is totally dedicated to God, totally dedicated to the ways of God. And that would certainly appropriately apply to Mary, among other things, but that's another kind of further discussion. And the third view was developed by the great biblical scholar of the 4th century, Jerome. And Jerome argues, as he comes to this section of the scripture, that often cousins were considered to be brothers and sisters, so that, remember, the families tended to live together, and so therefore the mention of these names, that they were cousins of Jesus, therefore brothers and sisters make sense. The difficulty with Jerome's conclusion, and this is one, by the way, that many preachers really will use, I don't know whether you'll hear it this weekend or not, but many preachers will use Jerome's viewpoint, who says that it was a custom to do this. The only problem with Jerome's response is nobody had ever heard of this custom before. Apparently, Jerome, who was always kind of creative in his interpretation of the scriptural text, may well have come up with this. Maybe a nice solution, keeps everybody happy, keeps the leaders, well, that's all well and good. So when you find the position that Jerome cites somewhere in the early tradition, let the scholars know, because so far no one has come up with Jerome's solution. But it becomes one of the more popular ones. So there are three ways of explaining the reference to for brothers and sisters of Jesus. All right. And the virginal conception, which, as I mentioned, is very important in our Christian tradition, is also important. And one other kind of quality that we have often mentioned here as a value in the Old Testament was the idea of shame. So the gospel writer Mark, and of course this will be picked up by Matthew and Luke, want to make sure that there is no shame brought to the family of Jesus, and so that it is an honorable conception. However, the conceiving of Jesus took place And that, of course, is well developed by Matthew and Luke in their infancy narratives. So, what's the problem here with the Nazarenes? Why are they so disturbed? Well, one interpreter of all of these events points out that it may well be the issue of familiarity. Perhaps the Nazarenes knew Jesus too well. They had grown up with him. He was the kid next door or the kid down the block. He was the carpenter. They knew his families. Their kids kind of played with his. They did all the things that growing up children did. Familiarity. How could this guy be so wise? And could he be? As we're hearing rumors down the roads and the byways that perhaps this is the Messiah, the promised one. No, we know who he is, and we're not open, or maybe they didn't say they were open, but they weren't open to the fact that God here was working in a way that they didn't expect and could not accept. And here we come against the very issue. Remember that in the previous experiences just coming before this episode had been wonderful acts of faith. Now comes a marvelous, or not marvelous, but in a certain way terrible act of unfaith. We cannot believe that this Jesus is the Messiah. Now, Jesus then says, well, no prophet is without honor except in his own hometown. Now, this was a proverb that was well known throughout the Jewish Greco-Roman world because familiarity often closed one's mind to the fact that they could come up with something new, something important. Prophets, and this is the introduction now, we've mentioned this before, but certainly it comes to play here. Prophets were readily respected and often greatly honored by those closest to them. Well, that's not the case here. And for that reason, and I'd like to now move on a little bit to the first reading from Ezekiel. For that reason, the prophet Ezekiel's opening words are also remembered today, and that's complementariness to the saying of Jesus that we hear here. Young Ezekiel, you remember, had grown up during the time of King Josiah, one of the last kings of the southern kingdom, or Judea, before it fell to the army of the Babylonians. So he grows up as a young man. He's really ill-prepared for the role to which God will call him. It will be a role that he will exercise for a number of decades, a number of years. And in the year 597, before the Common Time, a significant part of the population of Jerusalem, where Ezekiel had grown up, were deported. Now, basically, those who lived around the city of Jerusalem were basically agriculturally, they made their agrarian, they made their kind of living through growing things, bringing it to Jerusalem. And it was a rather traditional society governed by the remnants of kings and the remnants of priesthood. So what happens, and Ezekiel is caught up in this, he is deported with a number of his fellow Jerusalemites to Babylon. And it is here that he will spend the rest of his years, rest of his time. So it is in, therefore, exile. See, so he had grown up in a familiar place, but now he is moved into a place that he was not familiar with, and to which those people who went with him were not familiar. And it is here that God calls Ezekiel to be his prophet, his spokesman. He says to Ezekiel, I'm sending you as my representative to the community of Babylon. That would be the Jews who are in exile there. And I'm asking you to speak to this audience, to tell them, and it's a rather long work. Now remember, we're here in the very opening part of this work, the second chapter. I'm going to have you speak to them, encourage them, kind of tell them where they went wrong and what the difficulties are that put you here, why you are in this situation. In many ways, Ezekiel reflects something of the earlier prophet Isaiah, and Ezekiel will turn out to be a visionary. He will, if you like marvelous visions and all kinds of colors and drama, Ezekiel has these. But here, and this is perhaps why this is chosen for our consideration this weekend, I am sending you to your own group to kind of speak to them, and they will not hear you. They will not listen. You will be rejected. Now you can see that as Ezekiel is being rejected by his own, Jesus is being rejected by his own. Now be careful, the words of Ezekiel are not just to the Hebrew community, but they can be well applied today. And maybe that's another reason why the lectionary includes Ezekiel. This isn't an anti-Jewish thought, but it's against those who refuse to accept anything new, who refuse to see things in another way than those that they have grown up with. And of course, that was true for Ezekiel. That's true about the Nazarenes. And some commentators smile and say, could that be true of us? And we immediately say, no, we would always be open to whatever God had to say to us. So interestingly, the villagers, as I mentioned in Nazareth, are astounded by what Jesus is doing. Jesus himself is amazed at their closed-heartedness, at their refusal to even kind of accept the possibility of the good news that he is bringing to them. As I mentioned, there are a number of phrases. Here was another one that would fit kind of the conclusion of the gospel we hear today. No prophet is acceptable in his village. No physician heals those who are known to him. Well, all right. Now, what is particularly acute in Mark's story here is that the hometown refuses to accept him. His relatives, and this was found in an earlier section of Mark's gospel, kind of think that he's going a little bit out of his mind, and his own household are not accepting him. So talk about having to come up against, a brick wall or against great resistance. Here, Jesus finds it in his hometown. And his amazement kind of limits his ability to do anything. Now, maybe again, as I pointed out before, Mark frequently mentions the humanness of Jesus. Wouldn't you be hurt if your own family turns against you? If your relatives think you're a little off the beam, and if they're ready to kind of move you into wherever you need to go in order to make them happy. So in Mark's gospel, which is very stark here, pictures, and I think this is maybe in conclusion, interesting to see Jesus is hurt by the fact that even in his own family, there are those who are not open to receiving the good news that God has called him to bring. They looked around in the other villages and towns, they have seen the good works he's done, but that does not seem to have affected their appreciation and understanding of him. So, as we come together this weekend, grateful that we honor Jesus, the carpenter, the worker, the man of God, the Son of Mary, as our brother and our Savior. We are grateful for his presence with us, and as we move forward, may we carry as he did, despite the fact that sometimes we are not totally accepted, carry on the mission of the kingdom, the mission of his church. Thank you, and we'll see you again.